Welcome to the Langford Academy. My name is Gwen Crump. I'm a specialist in veterinary anaesthesia and analgesia, and I work here at Langford Vets as an anaesthetist, and I also run a chronic pain clinic with my team of physiotherapists. I'm going to talk to you in this series about chronic pain in dogs and cats. So we're going to think about what chronic pain is. We're going to think about how to recognise chronic pain. And then we're going to think about some treatment considerations and some case examples, using osteoarthritis and neuropathic pain as examples. So what is chronic pain? Pain is a multidimensional phenomenon. We see the sensory component, and this is to do with perception, intensity, the quality and the location of pain. We see the physiological component, that is nociception and the stress response. We see the affective component of pain, and this relates to the negative emotion, anxiety and fear surrounding the pain experience. And notably, a positive affective state can override pain perception. We see this typically when your old arthritic Labrador mopes about during the day, but then is very happy to chase after a squirrel in the garden. And this makes people believe that their dog doesn't have pain. We see the cognitive component of pain, and this is to do with the interpretation of that pain. What does it mean for me? Is this dangerous? And then the behavioural component is really about the coping strategy that the animal uses to express its pain, to avoid pain, to control the situation. So acute pain, we need to first think about, is related to actual or potential damage, tissue damage. It tends to be acute focused pain. It's adaptive. So the point is, it is useful pain. It helps us to understand that we need to move away from the source of the pain. It's associated with inflammation and healing. And it tends to recede once healing is complete in the normal situation. Whereas with chronic pain, that sensation might be more diffuse. We may see a mixture of pain types coexisting. We tend to see hypervigilance developing, and this is a survival mechanism from an evolutionary perspective. We see subtle behaviour changes, and animals adapt to this pain over time. So it is more difficult potentially to detect. We see the development of stress behaviours. And this diagram is indicating how you might have an injury, which you start to recover from, pain starts to recede, and then you have a relapse. So this is typical for arthritis, for example. And again, you have a recovery phase. You might have another relapse and another recovery phase, but what you notice over time is the peaks of the pain are getting worse, and it's not going back to baseline each time. So overall, we have a worsening pain picture over time. So how does chronic pain develop? Well, we see our first pain, which is involved with C and A delta fibres, causing a brief activation of the spinal cord. This signal is transmitted to the brain, and we see primary hyperalgesia, localized allodynia, which means a sensation of pain from a stimulus that should not be painful. Peripheral sensitization develops, and we see an influx of local inflammatory factors. Nociceptors are sensitized, and we have a reduction in the action potential threshold, making nerves easier to fire. We see recruitment of new nociceptors. Then we see secondary hyperalgesia, and this results from central sensitization. The spinal cord dorsal horn becomes sensitized. We see activation of NMDA receptors and an influx of calcium into the cell bodies. Again, we see a reduction in action potential threshold, and we see an increase in the receptive field of the area of allodynia. we start to see sustained pain and central nervous system changes occur, such as sprouting of new nerve terminals and the release of new excitatory receptors, the loss of inhibitory interneurons, and a failure of descending control of pain. We see long-term potentiation. And this all leads to a pathological disconnection of pain from its original source. So you can have tissue healing occur, but actually pain persists despite healing. And this is all a little bit like turning up the volume button on your amplifier. In this slide, I've tried to illustrate what's going on physiologically. So we have a stimulus such as might occur in osteoarthritis, which is subsequent, for example, to the instability of a joint that's caused by a cruciate ligament injury that's not been treated. We see local release of neuroinflammatory mediators which sensitize the nociceptor. This signal is then transduced to and transmitted to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. We then see projection to the brainstem, and then this is perceived in the cortex as pain. In a few minutes, that nociceptor cell body makes some new receptors, and this is peripheral sensitization. But also we see modulation of these signals. And we know that this is useful for survival. For example, if an animal injures itself, it is still able to function because the pain can be somewhat inhibited through this modulation. And it's important to remember that the perception of pain only happens once the signal reaches the cortex. Pain is not pain until it reaches this point. Up until that point, it's just a physiological changes in the nervous system. Descending inhibition from the brainstem dampens that dorsal horn excitability, which is what I was talking about with this modulation, and it reduces that pain perception. And then healing can occur and the pain starts to recede. And this is the normal endogenous control of pain. So I've illustrated descending inhibition in the blue. However, when pain persists for hours, days, or weeks, the dorsal horn neurons become sensitized. We see alterations in descending controls, the descending control of pain, and further dorsal horn sensitization, illustrated here by the color turning red. And in fact, what we might start to see is descending facilitation instead of inhibition. And this results in the pain amplification I was just talking about, where we turn up the volume button. And note that the blue inhibition has disappeared on this diagram. We see a loss of descending control of pain, or a reduction in descending control of pain, where chronic pain exists for a very long time. And this is part of the problem. And here we have secondary hyperalgesia, as I described before, where a much wider area starts to become sensitized, and the further up the limb becomes uncomfortable from just the original injury.